Eldest Son of an Eldest Son by Fallon Walker, Chapter 2. The entire kingdom mourned for Queen Belinda, for she had been good and kind and brave and had helped her trophy hunter husband ascend to something higher than the truly mediocre leader he would have been otherwise. The king's greatest regret, the thing that haunted him, was that since the truncated fight with the dragon, he'd lost the use of his legs and could not pursue the dragon for revenge. He offered a reward for any that might bring him Balsinew's eye, but none had ever returned. The castle, once a warm and happy place, grew cold and hostile. The best Allard could hope from his father was to be ignored, because whenever he was the subject of his father's focus, he was the focus of his father's displeasure. His father would complain about the way he dressed and the way he talked and how it was going to be next to impossible to find Allard a husband, which Allard was quite fine with. His father mostly focused on training Braxton to one day take the throne. Braxton was mostly interested in torturing the mice he trapped under his bed. Allard would always set the mice free, but Braxton could always find more. So Allard mostly stayed out of his father and brother's way. He trained with the sword he wasn't supposed to have, and read of the great deeds of the kings of old in the books he'd been told were quite improper for a young lady. A year after losing his mother, Allard had given up on the idea of ever smiling again, until a very strangely dressed man arrived at the castle door, announcing that he'd been hired as Allard's etiquette teacher. This was strange for a number of reasons. The first was that he seemed to have just appeared inside the castle walls. Some children claimed they'd seen him floating over the trees and that he just floated into the inner hold of the fortress-like castle. The second reason was that no one remembered hiring an etiquette teacher for Allard, but when they went through their records, they found it had indeed all been arranged. The man wore a large black hat dotted with sparkling starlight, an emerald green cloak, and dark spectacles, the likes of which the castle staff had never seen. He had long dark hair and a mouth that never seemed to quite stop smiling. He called himself Dwenin. Dwenin was shown to his young charge's quarters. The maid who guided Dwenin to Allard's room warned him that the eldest royal child was a bit strange, insisted on being called a boy. "But maybe you'll fix all that." Dwenin had no intention of fixing all that. He had much more interesting plans for Allard. When Dwenin officially met Allard, the boy was drawing a battle plan for some toy soldiers he was not supposed to have. The toys were arranged in an elaborate battle sequence. At first, the boy did not hear him approach. When Allard finally looked up, he made to shove the soldiers back into the box, but Dwenin held up his hand. "Wait." He walked over and looked over the battle and Allard's plan. "Why not attack from this ridge?" Dwenin asked, pointing to a few soldiers standing at the edge of Allard's bed. "We lose too many soldiers that way," Allard said. He looked down and drew a few more soldiers in the trees along the banks of the Blanket River and then arranged them accordingly on the battlefield. "What does it matter?" Dwenin asked. "They're just tin." Allard's eyes flashed up to Dwenin. "They won't always be." He returned his attention to his battle plan. Dwenin smiled. The boy was all he'd hoped for when he'd seen the unclouded rains, though quite serious for someone so young. He'd have to see if he could do something about that. If there was no laughter in a ruler's heart, the weight of his great responsibility would crush him. Over the next 11 years, Allard learned many things from Dwenin: statecraft, battle strategy, basic defensive magic, body marching songs, animal husbandry, figure drawing, public speaking, irrigation, sanitation, mythology, languages, sword fighting, and Allard's great passion, cartography. Dwenin took Allard to visit battlefields to tend to the wounded, so he would understand the cost of war. He had Allard help a family put up hay for harvest, so he understood backbreaking work. They visited jails and monasteries. They traveled to distant lands where Allard learned the ways and customs of their neighbors near and far. Dwenin taught him so very many things, but they never did get around to etiquette. On that front, Allard needed no help. As Allard grew older, he began taking diplomatic trips that no one seemed to know anything about. He would return with cuts and bruises on his face and person, and he wouldn't stop smiling for days afterward. When asked about these trips, he grew uncharacteristically elusive and would quickly change the subject. One day, Dwenin followed him. The prince rode through the night to the next realm over, mostly keeping to the trees to avoid other riders on the main road. Dwenin soared over the trees to keep pace with him. Finally, the prince arrived at his destination, a tournament. He put on his armor in the woods and then emerged to sign up to compete. He easily dominated in every category, but he never once removed his helmet during the entire competition. After he was awarded his final trophy, he climbed on his horse and disappeared into the trees. He rode for a time, and Dwenin silently followed. As a wizard, he was quite good at avoiding detection. He finally came upon Allard laboriously removing his armor in a small clearing, his handsome face bright red from the heat, his dirty blonde hair sweat-matted to his forehead. "Why do you not remove your helmet?" Dwenin asked as he stepped out of the trees. Allard jumped and then rolled his eyes and went back to removing his armor, quite a feat with no squire to help him. "Because I do not wish to shame my opponent," he said. "And why should they be ashamed?" "Because they lost," Allard said. He worked at the buckles on his chest plate. He had to twist and bend to get at them. "Someone always loses. The honor is in the attempt," Dwenin said. "Because they lost to me." "A formidable opponent?" Allard sighed. He kept his eyes on his work. He knew where Dwenin was leading him, and he had little patience for it. He just wanted to get out of the hot armor and dive into the pool nearby, perhaps admire his trophy, revel in how it felt to act and be treated as a man, if only for a few hours. "What lesson are you hoping to impart, Dwenin, and can you deliver it quickly?" "The lesson I hope to impart, darling boy, is that there's no shame in losing to you. You are one of the most skilled swordsmen in the kingdom." "No one else sees it that way." Allard finally got his chest plate off. He threw it, and it clanged against his other armor. "And they never will unless you show it to them." The wizard knew that the time was nearing when Allard would have to accept who he was and begin the long, hard road of forcing others to accept him as well. But it seemed they were not quite there yet. So Dwenin continued to accompany Allard on his diplomatic trips, and he watched with pride as the boy grew in confidence and skill. As much pride as Dwenin took in Allard, he felt an equal amount of horror when he looked to Braxton, the future king. Braxton was cruel, petty, and capricious. He showed little concern for his future subjects and delighted in the potential bloodshed of war, as long as he did not have to take on any risk himself. Allard had invited Braxton to accompany himself and Dwenin on one of their visits to the front, but Braxton had grown suspicious and accused Allard of plotting to have him assassinated and threatened to have his fingernails pulled from his traitor hands. Then, when Allard returned, he whined that Allard had failed to bring him a present. This was the boy who would be king. Late one afternoon, they were studying moral philosophy in Dwenin's tower. Allard was having trouble wrapping his mind around the material. His eyes kept drifting to the window, and every time they did, Dwenin would whack him on the head with a long staff. They were both in foul moods. It was late August. The afternoon seemed to stretch on forever. Dwenin's tower was hot and stuffy, and Allard's father was dying. So when Allard again failed to understand what Dwenin was teaching him, and once again caught staring out the window, he lost his temper, which was actually quite rare for the young prince. "What does any of this matter?" he cried. "What is the point of all this?" He slammed the book closed. "To prepare you," Dwenin said. "For what? There is no great future waiting for me. I ought to enjoy the time I have left." "And what does that mean?" "My father or my brother will marry me off to some king to solidify an alliance, and I shall be queen of some country that will never be my home," Allard said. All of this was bad enough, that he would be forced to live far away from his heart in the beautiful kingdom he had called home all his life. But even the loss of his home was not the greatest horror he faced. "I shall be forced to live as something I am not. They'll stop me cutting my hair, force me to wear a dress, and expect me to take up needlepoint and butterfly collecting and smiling. So I should enjoy the little time I have left, enjoy the freedom to live as I truly am for a bit longer, not waste it sitting in a stuffy room reading dusty books." "What if you could live as you truly are forever?" Allard snorted. "It will never happen." "What if it What if it could? Dwenin asked. Then I would ask what it has to do with all these books. A king should be well-rounded and well-learned. I'm not going to be king, Allard said. Why not, darling boy? You are your father's eldest son, are you not? Dwenin asked. You know that's not how it works. Braxton will be king. That is the law. It's what father wants. I'll teach you all this so that we might persuade him, Dwenin said. Allard hesitated. It seemed too much to hope, but he wished it so. All great endeavors began with this feeling. One never did anything great without having the audacity to believe things could be better than they were. Do you really think he could be persuaded? Dwenin nodded. I do. Allard allowed himself a bemused smile. Then he opened his book back up. Then I suppose we better get to work. For the next few days, they discussed their strategy to approach Allard's father with their proposal. Allard had his doubts about whether any strategy would work. His father had informed him that he only called Allard by his chosen name out of deference to his mother. On the few occasions Allard had persuaded his father to take him on one of his hunting trips, the king cut the hunt short. His father seemed annoyed when he hunted well, and even more annoyed when he hunted poorly, perhaps sensing that Allard was doing it deliberately. He'd never been able to determine what he could give his father that would please him. But Dwenin was very clever, and he knew people. If he said Allard's father could be persuaded, then Allard trusted him that it would work. Eventually, they had prepared all they could. There was nothing to do but try. The king sat on the throne, listening to the petitions of his subjects. As always, Allard sat by the king's side and made notes on the needs of the subjects. He sat somewhat sideways in his chair, to better keep his ear pointed toward whoever was speaking so he wouldn't miss anything important in the echoing great chamber. Braxton grew bored and murmured cruel commentary to one of his advisers, who was forced to look sufficiently amused so as not to provoke Braxton's ire, but not so amused that the king grew angry at his disrespect. Once all the petitions had been made, the king gestured for his servant to prepare his wheelchair. But then Allard stood and climbed down off the dais and knelt before the king. Dwenin joined him. Your Majesty, I would like to petition the court, Allard said. Braxton snorted at this. The king gestured for Dwenin and Allard to rise. Yes, child, speak. Allard took a deep, steadying breath. No matter what happened, things were going to be different after this. He looked his father in the eye. I ask that you recognize me as your firstborn son and name me heir to the throne. Braxton cackled, clapping his hands together in delight. Oh, this was most diverting. King Cedric did not look pleased by this request, but Allard did not wilt under the power of his gaze. Braxton is my firstborn son, my only son, the king said. Forgive me, sire, but I disagree. Born a girl I might have been, but surely you cannot look upon me now and see a daughter. I am your son and rightful heir, Allard said. The king's advisers exploded into a flurry of whispers. Then one adviser stepped forward. Surely the princess is not suggesting... The prince, Dwenin interrupted, suggests nothing. He states it boldly. He should be king. Cedric slowly shook his head, but he still hadn't said no. Not yet. Dwenin continued quickly, hoping to finish the proposal before they were thrown from the castle or much worse. It is customary for kings to complete great deeds when they are crowned, is it not? Sire, before you were crowned, you slayed the ancient and terrible sea beast of Tarborough. So what if you were to allow young Allard to complete such a feat, prove himself worthy of being your heir? The king appeared to genuinely consider this. And what feat do you suggest? Dwenin already had several feats in mind that were impressive but well within Allard's skills. The Wolf of Folsom Woods has stalked the people of the nearby village for decades and none have been able to slay it. The wolf was said to be 40 feet tall with an outsized appetite to match, but Dwenin knew Allard could defeat it. The king seemed unmoved. Dwenin next suggested the serpent of Halsbard Lake, or the trolls in the mountains, but the king rejected each of these suggestions. Allard could feel his chance to be king, to be his father's son, slipping through his fingers. "Bolsonjew," Allard said. The king, Braxton, Dwenin, and all the advisors stared at him. He and Dwenin had not discussed this, but Allard knew it was right. This was what he was meant to do, though the dragon struck fear into his heart and still haunted his nightmares. It was to be his great quest, but it would mean nothing if he wasn't afraid. There was no bravery in certain victory. His father would never be convinced by anything less. "I shall slay Bolsonjew," Allard said, "the dragon who stole a mother from her children and a great queen from her nation. I will kill Bolsonjew and bring you his glittering eye. Then you will recognize me as your son, as your heir." "Father!" Braxton cried. "Surely you cannot be considering this!" The king ignored Braxton. He looked at Allard, really looked at him, rather than the flitting gaze he usually used, as if looking at Allard too long was painful for him. Allard felt like he had to go on this quest. He was meant to, and beyond that, he found he wanted to go. The simple, exuberant joy of adventure almost underway. Though this feeling was quickly quashed as he looked to his younger brother's face and saw the shock and fury there. Allard felt a pang of guilt, but not enough to rescind the proposal. This was his destiny. He turned his attention back to his father, who had finally come to a decision. Cedric slowly nodded. "Yes, kill that monster, and the throne is yours." Allard nodded. "Thank you." He left the throne room before his father could change his mind. He had much to do before his quest began. Dwenin lingered for a moment. "Thank you, sire." The king nodded. "Send Allard to my chambers. I would have words." Dwenin nodded, and as he left the room, he closed the door quickly behind him to muffle the sound of Braxton screaming.